In the heart of West Africa, under the simmering heat of the Sahel sun, a boy named Ibrahim Traoré was born in the modest village of Kura, nestled in the Bondakai department of Mohoun province in Burkina Faso. The year was 1988, and life moved slowly in the dusty settlements far from the centers of power. Ibrahim's early years were shaped not by political ambitions or revolutionary dreams, but by the cadence of rural life, herding animals, helping his parents with household chores, and walking long distances to school under the burning sun. In those years, there was no foreshadowing that the boy playing barefoot among goats and millet fields would one day lead his country through one of its most turbulent periods. His parents, devout Muslims and modest people, instilled in him the values of discipline, integrity, and service. As he grew older, these values followed him like a silent shadow. He attended primary school in Bondakai and later moved to the larger city of Bobo Dioulasso for his secondary education. It was here, amid the bustle of urban life and exposure to new ideas, that his mind began to expand beyond the boundaries of his village. He became known not for his loudness but for his quiet determination, often burying himself in books, especially those related to science, politics, and African history. In 2006, with a growing interest in the earth sciences, he enrolled at the University of Ouagadougou to study geology. It was a period of intellectual awakening. At the university, Traoré began to engage with political debates and student activism. He joined the Association of Muslim Students and later became involved with the National Association of Students of Burkina Faso, a Marxist-oriented group known for its fiery opposition to imperialism and its deep criticism of the government's policies. His peers noted that he was not one to deliver long speeches or dominate meetings, but when he did speak, people listened. He had a calm authority in his voice and an ability to connect with the suffering of ordinary people. These years were critical in shaping the ideological foundations that would later guide his leadership. After completing his university studies, he made a decision that surprised some of his friends. Rather than pursue a career in geology or academia, he joined the military. It was a choice born out of conviction rather than convenience. The Burkinabe army, though riddled with challenges, offered a pathway to serve the nation and defend its sovereignty. In 2009, he officially enlisted and underwent training, including specialized anti-aircraft instruction in Morocco. The discipline of military life suited him well. He was focused, efficient, and rapidly earned the respect of his superiors and peers alike. In 2014, he was promoted to the rank of lieutenant, and over the following years, he would find himself at the center of some of the most dangerous conflicts the country had faced in decades. Burkina Faso, once known as Upper Volta, had for years struggled with political instability, poverty, and a growing threat from militant Islamist insurgents. The northern and eastern regions in particular were becoming increasingly ungovernable, plagued by attacks, kidnappings, and massacres. In 2018, Ibrahim Traoré was deployed to Mali as part of the United Nations peacekeeping mission in the region. There, he gained valuable combat experience and developed a deeper understanding of the regional dimensions of terrorism. He fought alongside international forces, but he also grew skeptical of the strategies employed by foreign powers in Africa. He began to view the fight against terrorism not only as a security issue but also as a symptom of a deeper imperial legacy that continued to strangle the continent. When he returned from Mali, he was deployed to the north of Burkina Faso, where he continued to fight against terrorist groups. Soldiers under his command often spoke of his bravery, his refusal to hide behind rank, and his unwavering presence in the field. Unlike some officers who stayed in command centers, Traoré was on the front lines. He slept in the dirt with his men, ate the same food, and shared their hardships. His commitment to his comrades and to the people they protected did not go unnoticed. He quickly became something of a legend among the troops, an officer who truly embodied the spirit of service. But while he fought in the bush, the political situation in Ouagadougou, the capital, was deteriorating. President Roch-Marc Christian Kabore, struggling to manage the crisis, was ousted in a coup in early 2022, replaced by Lieutenant Colonel Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba. Many hoped that Damiba's military credentials would help stabilize the country, but under his leadership, the security situation continued to deteriorate. Towns fell to insurgents, and civilians fled in the tens of thousands. Disillusionment spread quickly within the ranks of the armed forces. It was within this climate of crisis and confusion that Captain Ibrahim Traoré, still only 34 years old, emerged as an unlikely figure of resolve. In September 2022, in a bold and calculated move, he led a coup that overthrew Damiba. The operation was swift and relatively bloodless, though it carried immense risks. For a young officer to challenge the military hierarchy and seize power required not only daring but also a deep belief that the nation could not survive on its current trajectory. On October 21, 2022, Ibrahim Traoré was sworn in as the transitional president of Burkina Faso. At just 34, he became the youngest head of state in the world, drawing comparisons to Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary leader who once inspired a generation with dreams of African sovereignty and social justice. For many Burkinabé, especially the youth, Traoré's rise felt like the resurgence of that revolutionary spirit. He wore military fatigues, spoke plainly, and refused to engage in the diplomatic courtesies typical of African heads of state. In a continent weary of corruption and elitism, his image, fierce, focused, and nationalist, resonated deeply. Yet the task before him was colossal. The country was in the grip of a full-blown security crisis. Large swaths of territory were effectively outside government control. Schools had closed, markets had disappeared, and millions were displaced. Traoré moved quickly to reorganize the armed forces, purge ineffective leaders, and bolster the ranks with local defense volunteers. He promoted community defense initiatives and sought to instill a new sense of urgency in the fight against terrorism. But his efforts were not limited to security. He also began to challenge the political and economic structures that, in his view, kept Burkina Faso subservient to foreign interests. One of his boldest moves was to distance the country from France, the former colonial power. French troops, who had been stationed in Burkina Faso as part of counter-terrorism efforts, were asked to leave. French media outlets were banned or restricted, and a wave of anti-French sentiment swept across the country. Critics accused Traoré of fanning populist flames, but he argued that Burkina Faso needed to reclaim its sovereignty and build new partnerships on its own terms. He looked increasingly to Russia and other non-Western powers for support. His meetings with Russian officials, including a high-profile meeting with President Vladimir Putin in 2025, underscored a dramatic reorientation of foreign policy. Traoré's rhetoric also took on a distinctly pan-Africanist tone. He spoke of African unity, of the need to end the exploitation of the continent's natural resources, and of resisting neocolonialism in all its forms. Alongside the leaders of Mali and Niger, he helped form the Alliance of Sahel States, a political and military coalition aimed at confronting terrorism and asserting regional independence. For his supporters, Traoré was not just a military leader but a symbol of Africa's renewed struggle for dignity and freedom. Yet leadership under such difficult conditions was never going to be smooth. As the months passed, Burkina Faso's security situation remained fragile. Reports of massacres, human rights abuses, and retaliatory killings by government forces and allied militias began to surface. Journalists and NGOs accused the military of targeting entire villages suspected of harboring insurgents. Press freedom was curtailed, and dissent became increasingly dangerous. Traoré defended his actions as necessary for national survival, but international human rights groups expressed growing alarm. Still, among many Burkinabé, especially in rural areas hardest hit by the conflict, Traoré retained a deep well of support. He was seen as someone who cared, who acted, and who remained close to the people. Unlike previous leaders, he had not enriched himself, had not surrounded himself with luxury, and had not sought to appease foreign powers at the expense of national dignity. His austere lifestyle, simple speech, and relentless focus on the task at hand made him both feared and admired. In 2024 and into 2025, his government launched ambitious infrastructure programs to restore roads, reopen schools, and resettle displaced populations. Though progress was slow and often disrupted by violence, there were signs of recovery. Community leaders reported improved coordination with security forces, and some villages began to rebuild. But the situation remained precarious. For every success story, there were still ambushes, attacks, and unspeakable tragedies. The war was far from over. In the international arena, Traoré continued to provoke strong reactions. While Western governments criticized his authoritarian tendencies and human rights record, many African youth looked to him as a new kind of leader, unapologetically African, deeply nationalist, and unafraid to challenge global power structures. On social media, videos of his speeches circulated widely, often accompanied by revolutionary music and imagery of Sankara. In classrooms and cafes from Dakar to Nairobi, his name became part of a new political vocabulary. Even as Ibrahim Traoré's image spread across the continent, on murals, in student notebooks, and in WhatsApp groups, the weight of governance never lifted from his shoulders. The internal reality of managing a fragile state amidst a relentless insurgency required more than symbolism or charisma. It demanded relentless coordination, intelligence, and often morally ambiguous decisions that blurred the lines between defense and repression. He understood this. He had no illusions about the purity of power. His own rise had come through force, not the ballot box, and he was well aware of the tightrope he walked each day between legitimate authority and raw coercion. Yet, despite the turbulence, Traoré's belief in the righteousness of his path remained unshaken. He viewed his mission as historical, almost spiritual. He spoke often of legacy, not his own, but that of Burkina Faso's martyrs, from anti-colonial fighters to Thomas Sankara himself. He rarely invoked his own name in public addresses, often speaking as "we" or "the people." Behind closed doors, however, he was acutely strategic. He kept a tight circle of advisors, mostly trusted military comrades, and relied on informal intelligence networks to gauge loyalty across the government and armed forces. Coup rumors surfaced regularly, but none gained traction. He had embedded himself so deeply in the ranks, earned such genuine loyalty, that any attempt to unseat him would face fierce resistance. His economic policy was as bold as his political vision. In 2023 and 2024, Traoré launched a sweeping campaign to nationalize key resources, particularly gold mines that had long been operated by foreign companies. The gold sector had made a few foreigners very rich while the Burkinabe people remained among the poorest in the world. He demanded renegotiation of contracts, imposed stricter environmental regulations, and even transferred several mines to state or community control. Western investors fled, decrying his policies as reckless and unsustainable. But Traoré was undeterred. He argued that true independence could not exist while foreign entities controlled the country's wealth. The gold beneath their soil, he said, would now fund hospitals, schools, and defense, not luxury apartments in Paris. These reforms were not without challenges. State-run operations struggled at first, and the sudden withdrawal of foreign expertise created operational gaps. Smuggling spiked. Armed groups attacked mining convoys more frequently, hoping to seize revenues. Traoré responded by militarizing key extraction zones and embedding special units within mining communities. He turned to new partners, Russia, Turkey, and China, for training, equipment, and technology. In return, he offered cooperation, not domination. These states, unlike Western powers, did not demand political reforms or electoral timelines as preconditions for partnership. His critics, both domestic and international, continued to accuse him of consolidating power under the guise of revolutionary patriotism. They pointed to the arrests of journalists, the banning of opposition parties, and the shrinking space for civil society. But Traoré offered a counter-argument grounded in pragmatism. Democracy, he said, must be built on a foundation of stability. Without territorial control, safety, and national unity, elections were meaningless. He promised that a return to constitutional rule would come, but only when the country could vote in peace and dignity. Until then, he would lead. There were moments of hope that pierced through the chaos. In 2024, villages in the Sahel region that had been abandoned for years began to receive returning families. Local schools reopened, supported by state-backed teachers and guarded by volunteer defense groups. Traoré visited several of these sites personally, often arriving unannounced, wearing his military uniform and surrounded by minimal security. He listened to local grievances, made promises on the spot, and watched football games with children in fields once scarred by war. These visits were filmed and circulated widely, reinforcing his image as a man of the people. But they were not performative. They were part of his governing strategy, to collapse the distance between the presidency and the population. The cult of personality that began to grow around him worried some of his advisors. They feared that the hero worship might one day become a liability, creating unrealistic expectations or masking critical weaknesses. But Traoré, while aware of these risks, did not discourage the admiration. In his mind, he was not the object of worship but the vessel through which national pride was being restored. As long as the image served the mission, he accepted it. Statues of him began to appear in some towns, often sculpted by local artists who saw him as a successor to Sankaro's legacy. Songs and poems were written in his name. His face appeared on T-shirts, murals, and even on school notebooks. In foreign policy, Traoré continued to chart an independent and sometimes confrontational path. In May 2025, he made headlines when he delivered a fiery speech in Moscow, standing beside Vladimir Putin. Speaking in a calm but defiant tone, he condemned what he called the organized looting of Africa under the flag of democracy. He spoke of the right of nations to choose their allies, of the need to build African-led defense industries, and of the dream of a continent where sovereignty was not conditional on Western approval. The speech resonated deeply in many African capitals, and though Western diplomats denounced it, millions of young Africans shared it online as a declaration of a new era. Traoré's emphasis on military and industrial self-reliance also led to a series of domestic initiatives aimed at reducing dependence on foreign imports. He revived Burkina Faso's textile industry, once vibrant before the flood of cheap foreign clothing. He promoted local agriculture, funded research into arid farming techniques, and introduced subsidies for farmers willing to return to conflict-cleared areas. These efforts were slow to bear fruit but represented a long-term strategy. The message was clear: Burkina Faso would not be a dumping ground for foreign products, it would stand on its own feet. As 2025 progressed, the country's condition remained fragile but no longer hopeless. Government control extended to more regions than the previous year. School attendance slowly increased. Road networks began to be repaired. Trauma, however, lingered everywhere, in the eyes of displaced families, in the silence of parents who had buried children, in the rubble of once thriving towns. Traoré's government launched a national healing program, combining trauma therapy, community rituals, and youth reintegration workshops. The goal was not only to rebuild infrastructure but to restore the social fabric torn apart by years of war and neglect. Behind the scenes, Traoré wrestled with fatigue and the burden of command. The pressure never ceased. Endless meetings, reports of attacks, threats of infiltration, rumors of betrayal. He slept little, trusted few, and leaned increasingly on a handful of loyal officers who had stood by him since the early days. He read extensively, not only military strategy and African political thought, but also literature and philosophy. He once told an aide that understanding history was essential to resisting its repetition. He saw himself as part of a continuum, not a lone actor, but one chapter in a long, unfinished struggle for African freedom. His critics were relentless, of course. Western analysts labeled him a populist with authoritarian tendencies. Some exiled opposition figures described him as a military dictator in revolutionary clothing. Human rights groups published reports on alleged abuses by state forces, and international media outlets warned of Burkina Faso's descent into isolationism. Traoré acknowledged none of this publicly. In private, he took note but refused to be swayed. His priority was not foreign opinion but national transformation. He often quoted Sankara, "He who feeds you controls you." For Traoré, independence was not a slogan, it was a policy goal, measurable, enforceable, and deeply personal. What lay ahead for Traoré remained uncertain. No leader could indefinitely rule without institutions to support governance. Even the most popular revolutions required structure, accountability, and eventual transition. But for now, his grip remained firm, sustained by the loyalty of the military, the gratitude of many civilians, and the vision of a Burkina Faso that belonged to its people. He did not rule by terror or indulgence but by proximity, by showing up where others would not, by making promises and trying to keep them, by reminding his country that they were not forgotten. His story, unlike those of many African leaders, was not yet closed. It continued to unfold in real time, written in the villages still under threat, in the minds slowly changing hands, in the hearts of children who watched his speeches and wondered if they too could lead. Whether history would judge him as a savior or a cautionary tale would depend not only on what he did next but on how his country, broken and beautiful, would find its way back to peace. But one thing was certain: The name Ibrahim Traoré had already etched itself into the consciousness of a continent awakening once again to the possibility of its own power.